Human rights are about people. They are about you and your life, your needs and wants and fears, your hopes for the present and the future, a safe home, food and clean water, healthcare, education, decent work and a livable minimum wage, to live in peace, to be free to express your opinion. These are your human rights. They are about who we are and how we live. They are the legal commitments all states have made to serve their people. Human rights don't belong to any political party or to any region of the world. They belong to all of us, to every one of you. Previous generations fought and even died for human rights. They built the international human rights system, bringing real improvements to the lives of people around the world. The full promise of human rights is still to be fulfilled. The evidence is everywhere. I urge you to stay the course, mobilize, use your voices and votes, reach out and connect to build strong social movements that stand up for your rights and those of future generations. On Human Rights Day and every day, I stand with you to uphold the human rights of everyone, everywhere.
Happy International Human Rights Day to everyone across the world. Now, this is the day that is observed every year globally on the 10th of December, commemorating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with emphasis on fundamental rights and freedom for all human beings, irrespective of race, gender, nationality, religion or language status. The day also marks the end of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and in South Africa we're celebrating 30 years of our democracy. Now, welcome to Asikhulume Let's Talk Mbogeli, this special broadcast by the SABC in collaboration with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and United Nations South Africa. Igama lami ngingubongiwe uMakhumalo waKwaZwane. Asikhumbuze ke Mbogeli ukuthi ungaba ingxenye lolu hlelo ngokushayela ngosizwe umbono noma umbuzo wakho. Inombolo zethu zocingo 0117140677 noma 0117140678. Ungabuya futhi usithole kumakhasi ethu okuxhumana ku-X @SABC Izindaba, ku-Facebook ikhasi lethu SABC Izindaba. Ukuze kubelula ke Mbukeli, sicela uqale ngo#Asikhulume, #SABC News, bese ke ubhala umbuzo noma umbono wakho. Kanti ke for this special broadcast sicela usebenzise lama tags #Our Rights Our Future, #Human Rights Day, and X handle @OHCHR_SA. Asikhulume Mbukeli. Now, Mbukeli, the theme for this year's celebrations, Our Rights, Our Future, Right Now, emphasizes how human rights empower individuals and communities to build a better future, with the emphasis on human rights as a pathway to solutions, playing a critical role as a preventative, protective and transformative force for good. Young people continue to confront significant challenges such as high unemployment, crime, sexual violence and inadequate access to quality basic education, among others. Now, since the youth represent the future of our nation in Mbogeli, it is imperative to address these issues with a dedicated focus. Now, before we discuss human rights challenges faced by young people in South Africa, let's listen to the conversation between Asikhulume producer Musam Khalipi and Activate Change Drivers Program Youth.
Issues that are faced by young people certainly are unemployment. They face a lot of challenges in getting jobs. They also blame the government. Some are in substance abuse, some are in crime, but we're having a lot of issues in terms of lack of unemployment and lack of information and youth development offices.
So as part of the Activate Change Drivers program, right, let's just talk about some of the work that you do and maybe some of the things that you implement being part of the program.
For me, I realized there's a gap in the township when it comes to challenges that are faced by the young people. So I decided maybe I need to start a program. So I'm running a mental health program. So that is just to have a safe space for youth to come through whenever life is a lot for them. So just for them to come through and just share what they're feeling and what they think.
So how can the youth begin to perhaps, I don't know, maybe start to understand the importance of mental health?
So I decided maybe I need to start a program. So I'm running a mental health program. So that is just to have a safe space for youth to come through whenever life is a lot for them. So just for them to come through and just share what they're feeling and what they think.
So how can the youth begin to perhaps help themselves and not really rely on government.
Remember, Mandoza once sang a song saying, now young people must come together, young people must be innovative. It's not like an issue of unemployment, but they can open themselves cooperatives, youth development, information center, and also unions, forums, and businesses so that they can equip themselves.
Now, Mbugeli, today we have different stakeholders in studio as well as via Teams who are in the human rights, justice, as well as advocacy space. It's a very important conversation, Mbugeli, as we look at the journey also for our young people. When you think about the fact that it's 30 years of democracy, but it's also International Human Rights Day, you think about gender-based violence. There are so many issues that young people are grappling with. And I'm going to start with you, Mweketse. When we think about young people, let's just talk about the importance, for example, of young people getting involved, and especially in advocacy work when it comes to the human rights space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bongiwe. Listen, I mean, I think it's important, you know, for young people to get involved, particularly in the human rights space, because, you know, the lack of participation from young people, as we've seen since 1994, has continuously decreased, right? One, through voting, but also given the fact that young people are genuinely despondent, right? Young people, as we saw in the clip, you know, that you played earlier on, is that, you know, they're living in communities where they're, you know, living the brunt of, you know, poverty, unemployment, and all those things. But, you know, I mean, with the work that I do through the National Youth Coalition, but also through the youth clubs that we have through the Ahmed Kathrara Foundation, we often have civic education workshops that we run with young people. And part of those civic education workshops is to say to young people, you must participate. Participation, participation, participation. We know the problems are many, and we have many problems in our country, right? Contemporary social issues affecting us as young people are many, but it is important for you to show up still, because again, this country needs you, and it's going to require all of us to participate in it in order to fix these contemporary social issues that have been highlighted by that video clip.
Colette, let me come to you. There's often quite a lot that we hear, especially as far as young people are concerned. Mweketse mentions voting, for example, and sometimes we think that maybe it's because they're apathetic, they don't know what's happening. When you look at this human rights, particularly when it comes to the human right of voting, do you think it's a challenge of young people not understanding its importance, or are we not communicating effectively?
I think the situation in the country is quite frustrating. I think the young people are losing confidence in the very constitution, in the very mechanism that enable us to enjoy fundamental right. The young people have been promised a lot in terms of you know, participating in schools as well, and accessing education, access to education with the basic needs, and also travel and movement of young people living in a safe environment as well. So these are some of the battles that our young people are facing. For example, sexual violence. We see that young women, young girls, there's the gender-based violence, which is so rampant without proper, you know, a law enforcement and ending the violations of human rights. And we've seen bullying in their environments where they are living in. So we are really living in a violent society where even young people are beginning to lose confidence in a very democratic state that we have created. I think the young people will come to board, will come and participate and enjoy the fruit if they see a responsive state, responsive institution and mechanism that are responding to their needs.
Shireen, one of the big things is that, you know, we talk about justice. We talk about, you know, access to justice. And one wonders, when you look at, you know, 30 years of our democracy and the young people now, how would you say we've fared as a country in terms of access to justice?
Well, let me first start by saying also Happy Human Rights Day. It's also another milestone in our country, because today was the day on which the Constitution was signed. And as you correctly point out, 30 years later, we've got to reflect and identify what successes we've had, but more importantly, what are the challenges that we still have to face. And when we when we look back 30 years ago, I, as a young person, didn't have a constitution when I went to university, as an example. There wasn't even a subject called human rights for us to study back then, before 1994. So I think when one looks at the milestones, we certainly have a very strong legal framework. Colette has mentioned issues of domestic violence. We now have a very strong trilogy of legislation, from domestic violence, criminal law, and the Amendment Act, apart from a whole lot of other policy frameworks that we didn't have so many years ago. The challenge for us now is, how do we use these instruments against the backdrop of human rights and the framework and the instruments that we've signed as a country to our advantage. And that's where we have a major gap. Looking at our country 30 years later, we just haven't empowered ourselves sufficiently to interact with these institutions and policies and the law, so that we get the kind of rights and the responsibilities and services that we deserve.
And I'm going to come back to that when it comes to just understanding whose role is it to conduct this education. But let me bring in our online audience. Celo, I'm going to start with you. As a young person in South Africa, share with me your view of this country 30 years on.
I'm Gen Z, by the way. Thank you very much. I can say we really have a long way to go. However, I really consider myself privileged to have access to certain commodities, certain institutions of higher education and the like. However, I really genuinely believe that the implementation of the Constitution is not really in alignment. On paper, we do have human rights, and we also have youth rights as young people. But I really feel not only the government or the civil society, but as individuals, we're really failing ourselves. I remember in the 6th grade when I first learned about the human right to dignity and how important it is. But every single day in South Africa, whether it's a rural or urbanized part of South Africa, I see the human right to dignity.
Let me come to you, Mam Kabela, because you know, there's a different conversation that's to be had, particularly with you, you know, in the advocacy space around climate change. How would you say it infringes on the human rights of young people?
Thank you so much for that question. And I'd like to say Happy International Human Rights Day to all our viewers and everyone here. So I definitely do believe that the issue of climate change is very nuanced, right? And there are various environmental and violations around the country. How this impacts the human rights of people in general is that it would impact their right to access healthcare, their rights to be able to move, sometimes the rights to education. For example, if we look at the floods that happened in KZN, a lot of young children, especially from townships, could not go to school. And if they went to school, they literally have to walk and cross rivers, right? And so we see that climate change is intersected with other human rights, the rights to dignity and the rights to basically live a very dignified life. And I think to just drive my point forward then, it is important that when we discuss human rights violations, we truly understand the intersectionality of each human right violations on other human right violations, because then when we think of a solution, we are also going to think of a solution where stakeholders aren't working in silos, right? A person who has a portfolio for climate change needs to work with the person who has a portfolio for basic education, because human rights in themselves and in their nature intersect. And so that is how climate change as a concept impacts human rights. And the focus here is clearly intersection.
And I want us to talk more about that when we come back. And Advocate Mokwasha, one of the things that I want us to look at is that when you think about the lead up to the elections, we spoke to a lot of young people who talk about the fact that they're unemployed, there's crime, there's so much going on, and they do not understand how their vote begins to change, the situation in the country. Let's speak to some of them who still hold that view that 2026 comes, I do not care because my circumstances aren't changing. Mbugel, agasithathe care for siyabuya khona manje nganyakaza. Welcome back to Asikhulume. Let's talk this International Human Rights Day. South Africa has grappled with the triple challenges of poverty, inequality as well as unemployment since the end of the apartheid regime. The legacy of apartheid and colonialism means that the structures of the South African economy and society itself are skewed to entrench inequalities and keep wealth concentrated in the hands of very few, while more than half the country continues to live in abject poverty. Let's continue then our discussion as well as in studio with our virtual audience as well. Advocate Sandra Mukwasha, I'm going to come to you because in the lead up to the election, we're speaking to quite a number of young people. And these are young people who are saying to us, for them, that, they've got serious concerns about unemployment, they've got concerns about poverty, they've got concerns about corruption, crime, you name it. And one thing they would ask us is that, how does my vote begin to change the situation in the country? It's just one vote. You still have a number of people who think like that. And I wonder, 30 years on, what do you say to a young person who still holds that view?
Good evening to your listeners as well, and once again, happy International Human Rights Day. I think the conversation is very difficult to have with youth regarding your vote as a representative of your voice. For years now, we've noted that political parties have not spoken to the youth and have remained silent on issues that affected the youth. And we have observed in 30 years, the youth has observed that our parents participated in the process genuinely by voting, and nothing has changed, or things have become worse. So the issue then becomes, in some cases, it's not just about using the vote as a measure of I don't know what to do with my vote. It's also a protest from the youth that's saying that, well, the vote has not actually impacted impactfully in society. I'm going to vote, but tomorrow I'm still going to be unemployed. What does that mean? So there are discussions where the youth are saying, I need my vote to mean something in action. Voting in action means that I need to have, if I vote for a particular political party, I then need to see change happening. And they've not seen change happening. I think I'm 32 years old, so I'm 2 years older than democracy. And the promise that our parents were given is, have your kids attending school. Access to education has hurdles for the youth. And, the fees must fall was a significant part where the youth retained their voice and said, this is what we want. But it's also not improved the lives of the youth. So they're saying that, what does my vote really mean? And some have used their votes or their lack of vote as a measure to say to political parties, hear me out and speak to me about what I really need on the ground and the change that I need on the ground. And not only when you need my vote, speak to me throughout the years, implement change so that I can actually see what's happening on the ground. And we've noted, unfortunately, there's an increase of youth who feel that political parties, government has failed them, including civil society and Chapter 9 institutions. The youth has this understanding that we have failed them. And for the first time, we are saying as the youth, we want to occupy those spaces. And we are occupying those spaces, but we still need those conversations about what does a vote mean for the youth.
Deborah, I'm going to come back to you online there in just a moment, but I want to bring in Mieketse on this conversation. You speak about conducting advocacy, work, as well as speaking to young people, getting them inducted in one way or another. The political system, does it speak to them 30 years on?
Unfortunately, it doesn't, right? The political system, as we know it, doesn't speak to young people. However, I still do think it's important to stress to young people to participate in the political system. And I say this because, one of the things that we also emphasize, particularly around, young people and participation, is that you need to also conduct research on the political parties and the independent candidates. Because remember, 29th May when we voted, we didn't just vote for political parties, there were also independent, parties, all right, or candidates, particularly at a national level, right?
How do they conduct this research, Minkit?
Yeah, so basically for me, like conducting research, one, speak with your peers, right? But also, like, young people are on social media, right? So don't just be on social media for the sake of social media, right? Like engage with, for example, people who are posting content, around like voting, what does it look like to vote and all those things, right? But also, I mean, there are placards, right? For example, political parties, but then also independent candidates, sometimes like they hold like, like local manifestos and all those things. And that is why we emphasize participation. And I'll make an example. One of the things that we, particularly in our workshops, we tell young people is that, yes, it's important to talk about national issues, the state of education and all those things. But at the end of the day, we all sleep in a municipal ward. And really what that means is that, the quality of our lives is dependent on the people who are running our local government, right? And, yeah.
Pardon me, I'm going to come in there because I do want us to circle back to this issue of local government, but I don't want to lose a certain point, and I want to pose it to Colette. Colette, Minkit is mentioning a crucial point here, to research on the manifestos. But sometimes these manifestos are Bibles. And we know that in some instances, a young person will say, how do you expect me to read 300 pages? And, while I've got this and I've got that, and sometimes I don't even have the data to do this. Is it now advisable to for political parties to compress these in order to be able to speak poignantly and in a pointed way to young people?
Yes, I think also the opportunity is provided by the very same political parties in their campaigns. They mobilize, they read, they engage, and there's all those questions and answer process sessions that are provided. I think what I felt that the young people were failing to do, I know that there were two that I met that were documenting, that were doing research, and they were able to identify those parties that were genuine about gender equality and the rights of women, the rights of children as well, and the youth. So they had very selling points that could be relied upon. So I feel that there was interest in listening to brilliant conversations and not verifying or not even challenging, some of those brilliant, ambitious promises that some of the political parties were making. So the young people, I think there was also an investment in certain political parties. I'm glad he's talking about independent candidates. This is where we ran education as well, educating the people in South Africa that, by the way, there's an opportunity for us to rise above board and then to really, detach from some of the political parties that we've been believing in them for many years.
And when we come back from the break, I want us to talk about accountability, Minkit. As you say, Shireen, we'll talk about gender-based violence. We're marking the end of 16 days, yet young people are still bearing the brunt in numbers as well of GBV. And they wonder, how then do I begin to engage with the system where I'm being abused as well, where I'm also facing quite a serious violation of my rights? How do we begin to empower them with information? Mbugeli, welcome back to Asikhulume Let's Talk. We're commemorating International Human Rights Day and focusing on gender-based violence. For this part of the show, the preservation of human dignity, particularly in the context of gender-based violence, remains a critical concern in South Africa. Now, despite legislative interventions as well as ongoing awareness initiatives, now, incidences of gender-based violence, including domestic abuse, sexual assault, as well as femicide, persist at alarming rates. Youth activism is a key part of the fight against gender-based violence in South Africa. Youth have participated in protests, demonstrations, as well as social movements to challenge the scourge. However, some youth feel the policies and practices don't reflect their experiences and that programs to prevent GBV aren't tailored to their needs. Now, before we continue with our guests, let's take a look at this interview by Musam Kalepi speaking to Sia Gentile from Not In My Name.
Gender-based violence is a national crisis and gross human violation. Should it not be considered a crime against humanity?
It most certainly should be considered crime against humanity, because that that's essentially what gender-based violence is. It is a crime against humanity, and we often, in our advocacy, emphasize the fact that women's rights, and I mention women because most cases of gender-based violence are perpetuated by men against women, not overlooking the fact that there are men who are perpetuated against. But so when we say that women's rights should be considered human rights, and so when you commit violence against women or children or any violence against anyone on the basis of gender, it should be considered a crime against humanity, and the punishment thereof should be fitting of the crime that has been committed.
What do you think the community can do even better to infiltrate or maybe educate and bring awareness, not just government, but actual normal people in communities, to make sure that we beat the scourge?
We need to be able, in our communities, to call each other out. In our spaces of leisure, in our taverns where we are drinking alcohol, those who are consuming alcohol, and they should do it responsibly, by the way. We must be able to call each other out. In our workspaces where we work, we must be able to say, no, hang on, but see, you just said 1, 2, 3. This is wrong. It does not make you any less popular. It does not make you any less of a man. Your masculinity is not threatened because you called out a friend who was behaving in a funny way towards a female counterpart. Men should do that to other men. Women should do that to other women, and vice versa.
Mbogale, let's continue with our conversation as we look at reporting on gender-based violence cases. Shireen, I'm going to come to you on this one. When it comes to reporting gender-based violence cases, we sometimes hear from the victims that there is no privacy when they go to a police station. As much as there could be a Tutuzela care center, for example, not very far from where they are, at times they're not directed to it. And they have to speak to a police officer right in front of everybody. And they feel that this is secondary victimization. How do we begin to change this?
I think this is where we rely on communities to identify those spaces where we may not have done very well in having either the right training, because we certainly do provide that training. We certainly will provide the kinds of accommodation. In fact, yesterday, our Deputy Minister opened one of the newer sexual offences courts in the Eastern Cape, where the incidence of sexual offences is extremely high. And these specialised courts are designed to ensure not just that that there's a full service of when you come into the court and how you report, as well as the sensitivity, because the officials are trained. Now, that doesn't mean that every court in the country has been designated. We certainly have been on a fast track to ensure that more courts are, but certainly this is where we rely especially on the NGOs in the area and any other of the services. And this is where I think the points you were raising, Moketsi, is where we use social media for social issues, but we don't necessarily use it to educate ourselves and to also highlight to others. Because you were saying that sometimes the information, especially on legislation, may be extremely legalistic, may not necessarily be as simplified so that it is accessible. This is where young people can then take advantage of demystifying some of the laws. And there are many, very many entities, community-based organizations that break down the information and the flow system that we find in the courts, so that when you enter the courts, you are able to then also call to order that police officer who hasn't treated you well. Because if you don't know your rights, you can't then enforce them and demand that whoever is assisting you treats you in a way that is sensitive to whatever experience you might be having.
So I want to bring in Bulelwa Adonis. Debucha, I'm going to come back to you online there in just a moment. But Bulelwa, you are in the space when it comes to gender-based violence, and right now, we're listening to Shireen, who says that you can be able to call out a police officer if they're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. But in reality, this is something that is extremely different, and sometimes you may find yourself actually being victimized for even knowing your rights.
Thank you so much for having me. And what you're saying is absolutely true. I think that what people don't realize what people don't realize is that unfortunately, it's a very hard task for people to come forward about who their predators are. I think in this example, in this case of calling out a predator who could be like a police officer, makes it a lot harder. I think it is very important to know what your rights are, and it's important to call people out. But we are very mindful of the safety of our victims and our survivors. For us, we always speak to them. We always ask them, what is the best situation for them first. So for us, in our case as an organization, when we speak to them in such circumstances, we inform them about what their rights are. And then when we go from there, we do let them know that, what the consequences are. I think it's important that people know both sides, essentially, especially in this book. Because as much as accountability is important, calling out is important, we still have to consider the livelihood of the victims and survivors.
Sia, I'm going to bring you in. The human rights space is one that is quite broad. And when you think about gender-based violence, you then have some young people who will kind of like seemingly think that they understand when there's, awareness campaigns. But in the nub of it, if you still see a 15-year-old girl, for example, being assaulted by their boyfriends and they still don't know where to go, it means that we still have a long way to go.
That's true, sure. I mean, already we've got this infrastructure that is our support system, that is the Constitution, and the assumption is that via osmosis, the whole country knows how it functions. Our education system has got a pedagogy that has already inducted some segments of gender-based violence awareness into it. And so that's a really critical part of at least planting the seeds of change, making sure that young people are more aware of their own bodily autonomy, making sure that should anything happen, if they are sort of victimized by a predator, that they're able to report to their teachers, their guardians in different scenarios. And in the work that I do as well, I think it's part of at least the infrastructure of the frameworks that we provide to ensure that there are these intentional conversations about providing awareness, making sure that people have the terminology at hand and know what gender-based violence actually means. What is that crime that is performed on you, whether it's verbal, whether it's in the digital space, whether it's physical, and those different dimensions of violation and ensuring that those crimes are reported.
And before I come back to all of you in studio, Deboho, let me come to you. When it comes to, issues around gender-based violence and you think of young people, is there an understanding, like Sia is saying, on a broader level, according to you, of what it actually is?
I think there's just a general misconception that people are born with an understanding of how to navigate the socio-political landscape. People do not. There's a general assumption that all information that is distributed and disseminated reaches all people. It does not. And so we have to ask ourselves, where is it that we think that people in society are finding access to this fundamental information? And so the school, being the basis of all access to education, needs to be the primary host of this source of information. And we have to make sure that it is done as a matter of urgency because it is not reaching people. How is it that people are made to understand their rights? Because when you don't understand your rights, how are you going to stand up for yourself and others when they are being infringed upon? Where is it that we are educating members of society about the law so that they may use it optimally in issues of gender-based violence? And so I think there has to be a rewiring of the education system to say, what is it actually that we are teaching in our schools? How is it that we are protecting members of society, as it were? And also then, how do we equip members of society? Because another thing is, how do we also not become the bystanders of the issues that happen in our everyday lives? So because human rights is really about rights and responsibilities, and we have to find a balance of both.
And when we come back, Tirani Siabulela as well as Gitu Medzi, I want us to talk about something else because, and all of us here in studio as well, that there's a culture in some of the cases where we see young people or even society saying, it's not my business, I'm not going to get involved. That culture, is still here 30 years on. How do we begin to re-conscientize people to get involved and not just be armchair critics? Mbuget, I guess take care for Siabu. Earlier, as we wrap the show on International Human Rights Day and focusing on gender-based violence, we cannot address gender-based violence and crisis without addressing entrenched patriarchy as well as gender-based power dynamics. Now, at the end of the day, it comes back to power, oppression, and the way resources are allocated. Let's continue with our discussion with our guests. I'm going to come to you, Dr. Manganyi. Briefly, let's look at, the issues around ensuring that there's enough education out there for people to know that what is even a power dynamic when it comes to gender-based violence, because some of these root causes aren't known.
Good evening, and good evening to the listeners and to the fellow panelists. That is such a critical and a pivotal question, because we have been doing gender-based violence work here in South Africa for at least the past 30 years. And in those 30 years, we've had there's a lot that we have learned in terms of what works and what doesn't work. And now we actually have a very good body of knowledge that tells us that when we implement programs that address the root causes of gender-based violence, one of them being rightfully, as you said, power dynamics and inequality between men and women, we can actually stand a far much better chance of transforming those unequal power relations. Yeah. And so as a country, I guess a call to action for us is that we need to begin to implement what matters, because we find that as much as I represent the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Response Fund, and we do encourage our implementing partners to implement programs that are more transformative, because we have to change those deeply entrenched societal norms and the power relations and the inequality that we see in our society.
Kate, I'm going to come to you. The Black Women Caucus, I mean, Black women, just that alone, when you mention that term, there's so much of the odds that are stacked up against Black women. Fast forward 30 years on, gender-based violence is a huge issue. Why is it that Black women are still at the receiving end in large numbers?
Then we'd need to problematize the entire scope of the world as it stands to answer that question. To be honest with you all, let me start off by greeting everyone, our viewers. It's so good to be on the SABC, country's preferred channel of engagement and education and news. My name is Kitumeti Fatima Tamodrati. I'm a feminist, I'm a social worker, and I'm the chairperson of Black Women Caucus. Black women historically have remained at the bottom of the food chain, and this is as a result of colonialism and apartheid. So it's a systematic issue that we are deep. And so when we look in terms of the manifestations and the residues, I often refer to it as that we're still dealing with the residues of colonialism and apartheid. So yes, we're celebrating 30 years of South Africa's democracy, but it doesn't negate that we're still dealing with some of the deep systematic issues and barriers that continue to place women, particularly Black women, on the margins of the economy, on the margins of decision-making, and not just decision-making in terms of, we think about decision-making in terms of our boardrooms, right? But even just in terms of our homes and communities. Issues of land and land redistribution, women still remain at the end, at the margins. But I think it would also be a disservice for us to just, paint Black women or, as these passive recipients, like we do nothing, we're just sitting there waiting to be saved. In fact, if we look at the past 30 years, and I would even argue almost 100 years, Black women have been leading the march in terms of advocacy, social mobilization, and social action in advancing women's rights. We do understand that for us to fully address the drivers that are perpetuating and driving gender-based violence and femicide, we need to have a difficult conversation around the structuring of the economy and how decisions are made, right? And so it's important that when we speak about gender-based violence and its prevalence, particularly within Black communities, we link it up to bigger developmental conversation. Because to speak about the positionality of Black women is to speak about the structuring of the economy. And so as the previous speaker said, that we can't fully address gender-based violence and its drivers without addressing the inequalities that drive and perpetuate particular scourge in our community.
Let me bring in Sibongile into this conversation, the Executive Director of Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa. Sibongile, there's often this conversation that gets had around, you know, the fact that there's so much of reports that we see on GBV and all of that, but the conviction rates also remain a challenge when it comes to the litigation aspect of it. When you look at policy, litigation as well, where are we falling short in addressing the scourge of gender-based violence? I think you need to unmute yourself, Sibongile. All right, I'm going to try and come back to you. Siyabulela, if I can come to you because, you know, when you think about outreach and education, which is what you're heading up at Ilitaleto, there is a difficult conversation that sometimes need to be had with communities when it comes to issues of gender-based violence. And this is around not turning a blind eye, pretending not to see what is going on around you. How do you begin to contend with that conversation?
Thank you for having me. And it's Ilita Labando, not Ilita Leto.
Oh, okay. Ilita, pardon me, yeah.
Yes. I think you know, as fellow activists, we have to have a common understanding of the issues, that the compounding issues that are at play, particularly within our communities, and we have to also have an understanding of the intersectionalities when it comes to these issues. You know, part and parcel of the problem why we've had such, you know, an inability as a nation to come to grips with the issues of GBV and how to effectively address it is that now we've, you know, applied a one-size-fits-all and not understanding that there are particular dynamics that affect each and every community, and particularly from a programs perspective and an interventions perspective, you know, people need to have an understanding of how to thoroughly address these problems within communities, and, you know, having an ability to go into communities, not coming there with a mindset that you are coming with all the answers, but the community themselves need to be part and parcel of the solutions that can be provided in helping to address the issues of gender-based violence. And the beauty of it is that, you know, it comes in a level of consistency. We cannot have issues relating to GBV only coming to the fold when it's 16 days of activism. It needs to be a 365-day approach. And this is how we can actually defeat the scourge, not only just limiting it to Women's Month, where all of a sudden we see it everywhere, where government will go out into communities, but throughout the year, they never, you know, they never in those communities. And, you know, they face significant resistance from those communities because government only comes out during those commemorative days. And that's the sad part, is that this is an everyday occurrence in our communities.
Let me try and move on to Sibongile and see, Sibongile, if we're able to talk to you now as we look at the issue of policy and litigation and where we could be falling short. Let's try and see if we can talk to you. All right, we're still struggling there with that line to Sibongile. I'm going to come back to all of us in studio here. When we talk about this issue of gender-based violence, Shireen, I'm going to start with you, and as we go through the room in about 30 seconds each. Where should we start, especially when it comes to seeing as much of the conviction rate as the cases that in some instances are reported and others going underreported as well?
I think, first of all, I think we've spoken a lot about empowerment, understanding, knowing your rights, knowing how to exercise them, and we've spoken about accountability. So in as much as it's difficult, the more we also call out, which is part of what the rights framework provides for us, and it's constitutionally entrenched, we need to create safe spaces so that we can appreciate what service delivery is and that accountability is part of that framework. In addition, Ketumetse made a very significant point, which is again one of the cornerstones of our constitution, that is the right, the dignity and worth of us, which is really something that we've always entrenched from our cultural aspects of Ubuntu, but also entrenched in the constitution and the most significant judgment that we ever had. And that is something we need to see as we are the subject of rights, not victims, and we don't need paternalistic support, but we are entitled to be treated with that dignity in all of the services that we engage with.
This conversation, you know, speaks of you cannot have, Colette, human rights without dignity. Certainly cannot.
We cannot have that, and that, you know, speaks to education as well. Societal, you know, construct that we have, the culture and religion, they are not open to what Shireen is speaking about, and Ketumetse as well. So we do have these deep-seated, you know, beliefs and practices that are not making way for education, you know, to permeate. I think now we need to deal with the issue of societal fabric, the fabric that is broken on a daily basis. We need to cultivate the culture of respect, the culture of human dignity and gender equality as well. I think these principles, they need to be educated even at family level. We cannot expect only education institution, the educators alone, to be burdened with the responsibility of running this mass education. So we need to do a lot starting from that level.
And I suppose in about 10 seconds, Mekete, this means then that we take it to the accountability level.
And part of that accountability level, you know, in addition to echoing some of what's been shared here by the colleagues, is also that as young people, we must also follow up. And what that looks like also means that saying that, listen, you know, people made promises, right, during the elections. Part of that was around, you know, addressing the issue of, you know, gender-based violence. So it's our responsibility as young people, but also working with the older generation. It's an intergenerational dialogue, right? To say, let's follow up, right? Where are you in terms of addressing GBV and all those things? What's happening to the GBV response fund and all those things? But also, it will require a whole of society approach and an intergenerational dialogue.
Sadly, we're out of time, but let me thank you all for your time. Mbugeli, we've sadly come to the end of this conversation, and it's one that I hope we continue to have, even on social media. And as you heard, even some of our guests, it can't be just a day's topic. It needs to be 365 days. Asibonge to all our guests in studio, as well as virtually. Nagini Babugeli Emakaya. Ogakumalo, Wagozwane Nitimbale, Asikhulume City, Agube Ngoksayo, Ayixabene.